Okay, on the last video, we talked a little bit about what 7 billion was. We're now probably at about 7.6 billion people on the earth. And we're going to look a little bit into the story of how that happened, why that happens, and some of the social and economic changes that occur in different societies that can influence whether their population goes up or down. Now, one of the biggest advances that really did help change population was the advent of agriculture. Food security, or having enough food to feed people, allowed them to congregate in greater numbers, have healthier children, and live longer. And so this idea of bringing in nutrition was an important part of the advent of agriculture. Now, another thing that happened was improvements in sanitation and medicine. So as we think about societies that have good infrastructure, have good economic strength and medicine and physicians available, healthcare available, that tends to also cause population growth. Now, are we exceeding the Earth's carrying capacity? The answer by Malthus in 1798 is that could happen, and many agree. So this is the Malthusian catastrophe. So if you think about how the idea of growing of time and the population growth, this line is the production of food and primarily. And then here's our population growth, right? And when at the point where production of food becomes less than the population of growth, then we have war, famine, and disease. And these things are already happening locally in some places where production of food can be impacted and population is growing. But could this happen to the entire planet? The idea, though, is that maybe not, in the sense that because of the growth in technology and innovation and creativity, technological advances can increase carrying capacity. And so we think about what are some of the inventions that people have come up with that have changed the face of farming and food production. We're going to talk about that in our unit on agriculture, but monoculture, irrigation, large, big pieces of farming equipment, that technology has allowed us to grow a lot more food per acre of land than we ever have before. And we could probably continue to do that. So we may be able to sustain a greater population on our planet than our initial evaluation would claim. What is the Earth's carrying capacity? That is a term that's used to describe how many people can the Earth sustain, its resources. And it's just an interesting graph. So each one of these people is an estimate from a scientist. And it says in a survey of 65 different estimates of the Earth carrying capacity, the majority of estimates put the Earth's limit at or below 8 billion, a number that we will exceed in about 15 years. And so at this time, we're at 7.6. This was a few years ago. But you can see that right here is about 8 billion. Once you start getting above that too far, the number of estimates get smaller and smaller. So it's sort of a prediction. You can look into the future and say the Earth has a limit. We know it has a limit. We can look into the future and say maybe what this limit might be, and then come up with ways to deal with that. Now, what factors influence human populations? Population size, birth and death rates, fertility, life expectancy, and migration. So remember, population size is important, because if I double a population of 10, that's only 20. But if I double a population of 100, that's 1,000. So the initial population size is important. We calculated yesterday birth and death rates, how many people are being born, how many people are dying. Of course, people coming in and out of the population affects the growth rate. Fertility, how many babies or children are families having per couple. Life expectancy, are people living long lives? And so once they are born, are they expected to live a long life? And then migration, how are people moving? People move in and out of populations, and that can affect population growth as well. Now you need to know these age structure diagrams. You looked at these in the population activity that we did. Rapid growth is where you have a very large base. These are all children, and at some point in the future they're going to reach their reproductive ages. The number of people that are not in their reproductive age is small, and because these large numbers of people in their reproductive age, that is going to cause the population to grow rapidly. You also can have no growth. Italy, Japan, Russia is like this. A lot of the older European countries, they have small numbers of children because many families are deciding not to have children. And so you have a young population that is reaching their reproductive age, and it's heavy on the older population. The United States is relatively slow growth. We have a pretty stable quantity of young people in our population. This bulge right here is the baby boomer generation, and I'm going to talk about that in another day. But we have a steady growth, more of a stable, and you can see this by the sides of the population pyramid. Now there are 3 stages to growth, looking at pre-reproductive numbers, post-reproductive numbers, and then reproductive numbers. So that kind of gives you a view, where are we going if we look at the number of people that are entering reproductive age. Reproductive age meaning how many babies are being born now, and then post-reproductive age, and that is people that are elderly in the population. Now again, here's a map or graph I should say of how population changed, really not until the Industrial Revolution. That's where you see that rapid increase. The Industrial Revolution brought jobs, food, medicines, life expectancy increased. That all contributed to population growth. Now let's look at some terms. Total fertility rate is important in looking at evaluating population growth, because it's the number of children a woman produces in a population throughout her life. And that will change over time. Used to be in the United States, for instance, people had really large families. Now, families are choosing to have, on average, a fewer number of children. And so that will change the actual growth rate. So if you look at from the 1950s to the future, less developed countries, the world, and more developed countries are all following this similar pattern. And that is, people are going towards large families to smaller families. The U.S. has a total fertility rate of about 1.8. Notice that replacement fertility, let's talk about that next. Replacement fertility is the number of children necessary to offset the death of the parents. So how many children need to be born to replace parents. And in places where you have a high death rate or a high infant mortality, a family might need to have more children in order to replace the parents. But in general, the total fertility rate is about 2.1 for most, in that sense. That's where we would like it to be. And if you look at that, look at the United States, its fertility rate is actually at about 1.8. We're actually having fewer children than we need to replace our parents. But because we have a good, healthy immigration, those numbers of immigrants are helping our population to continue to grow. The world is at about 2.4. South Korea is about 1.2, and you can see Niger here is at 7.2, which is a large number. But again, all of the world is trending down from large families to smaller ones. Replacement level in developed countries is about 2.0, and that's due to high levels of industrialization, income. In fact, there's an article in 2019 that Utah fertility rates fell below the replacement fertility rate for the first time. For developing countries, it's a little bit higher due to high levels of infant and child mortality, and so more children are born in those families. Because of this, countries have come up with a variety of ways to tackle population growth and population decline. In China decided, because their population growth was so substantial, to have what's called the one-child policy. But they have since decided that that was not a path they wanted to continue going down. So now families are allowed to have 2 children. But it was just a way for them to try to manage the rapid population growth they had, and their population growth is now stabilizing and will be declining. Another thing that we need to talk about with respect to fertility and population growth is women. The more educated women are, the more choices they'll make to have babies at a later age, especially if they are educated and they have jobs. Empowering women turns out to be one of the most important things that you can do to change rapid population growth. Is education, jobs, and family planning opportunities will change rapid population also. Female life expectancy is another way to measure kind of how populations are going to grow or decline, because the death rates are smaller. Women do live longer than men in general, and you can see that from 1980 to about 2012. These women have a longer lifestyle across the globe. Now, life expectancy in general varies. So if you look at the areas in red, life expectancy is over 80. So the United States is in that situation. Used to be, probably when I was a child growing up, it was in the 70s primarily. But then if you go into some of the less developed countries, the life expectancy can be as low as 45, 50. But again, all of these countries in all of these places are trending towards better infrastructure, better economic growth, and a better life expectancy. Infant mortality is also an important measure of population growth. Infant mortality indicates lower health care, not as good of infrastructure, things like that. And infant mortality around the world is dropping, but in less developed countries, you're going to see a higher infant mortality rate. In developed countries, as developed countries go, we are one of the highest in infant mortality rates than most other developed countries. So what can affect the mortality rate and child mortality rate in a country? All the things you can imagine that affect people's health. Health and prenatal care, adequate food security, nutrition, potable drinking water, good sanitation, and moderate to low levels of pollution, so people can live healthy lives. Okay, so on Monday we're going to be looking at how society deals with impacts of population change a little bit more, and that ends this session 2.